Hello everyone, and welcome to, well, I was going to say World of Warships Blitz, but this is a slightly adjacent topic. World of Warships Blitz history, let's call it. Recently, somebody in the comments asked, well, Terry, you're talking about treaty cruisers all the time. What is that? What treaty are you referring to? And you know, the thing is, if you've been looking at things like naval history for a couple of years, you would have effectively come across the term a couple of times. But you also lose track of the fact that not everybody does that. So I figured, well, I can make a video about the naval treaties, but there are others out there who, know a heck of a lot more about these things than I do. I'll leave a link in the description to Joachim frankly astonishingly good video about the Washington Naval Treaty. And why would I make another one of those? However, what I can do is kind of try and combine that in a more summary form with World of Warships Blitz and make use of the game to tell a bit about the history of the game, because this is something I enjoy doing anyway. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1921. How did that came to pass? Well, extended history section now. So, first of all, World War I happened. And some argued that one of the reasons World War I happened was because the Germans and the British got into a little bit of a naval arms race, because the Kaiser wanted to rule the seas and the British weren't having any of it. At the end of World War I, the German Navy sort of ended up at the bottom of the sea after being interned by the British, because the Germans decided that, nope, if we can't have it, you can't have it either. The French and the Italians were not too pleased about this, because they actually wanted some of the ships. But it was what it was, and at the end of World War I, the Allies, being the British, the Americans, the Japanese, the French, and the Italians that were fighting the Central Power at the time, were coming together for a treaty. How about the Russians? Well, the Russians were busy inventing communism, so they weren't invited. How about the Germans? Well, the Germans lost both the war and their navy, so they weren't invited either. But they came together to sign a treaty on naval construction, because they were a little bit concerned that there was a bit of an arms race going on. Also, after the Treaty of Versailles, which effectively blamed the Germans for everything and put very restrictive reparations on them, plus limited their navy to a couple of coastal boats, more or less, the Allies were lacking a common enemy. And they figured out that they weren't actually getting along with each other that well after all. The Americans under Wilson, back in wartime, did want to be the number one naval power. The British were not very happy about that, because the British wanted to be the number one naval power, because they had been for quite a while. The British also had a lot of ships. A lot of these were rather outdated. The Japanese and the British were actually allied at the time, which is something the Americans weren't very happy about, because they, in a potential conflict, did not want to fight the Japanese and the British at the same time, because then they wouldn't have enough navy to do so. Also, there had been a bit of a war going on, plus there was a pandemic. So the next American president, Harding, was someone of an America First. I don't think he wore a red cap, but he was definitely one for isolationism, and the Congress at the time was not very happy with the amount of budget that the American Navy was demanding for the construction of all these new ships, because, you know, stuff's expensive, economy isn't working, people aren't happy. The British at the same time were not quite as broke as they're often made out to be, but obviously had been fighting a major war on the European continent, and did need to get their finances in order, so they didn't want to build an awful lot of ships either to match up with everybody else. The French were completely broke, but still had delusions of grandeur of their colonial empire. And the Japanese were sort of preparing for a clash with the American Navy. For that, they reasoned they would need about 70% fighting power of the American Navy, because they weren't expecting having to fight them all at once. But given that half of it sits in the Atlantic, the other half sits in the Pacific, they could defeat them in detail, and for that 70% would be fine. The slight problem in that calculation was the Japanese had about 20% of the economy of the Americans. So how exactly they planned to do all that was a good question. So everybody was sort of having an incentive to come together in that naval treaty in Washington that was initiated by the Americans. Now, to nobody's great surprise, at least to nobody's great surprise, if you've been following politics or relatively recently in the past years, the Americans spied on absolutely everybody, especially the Japanese, which gave them the distinct advantage of knowing what the minimum conditions were that the Japanese were going to accept. Carriers weren't really a thing yet. People had started inventing carriers, but mostly they were still really focused on capital ships. So they came up with a tonnage limit, or at least a tonnage limit ratio. And I'm not going to go through every single detail of the treaty here, but effectively the idea was that the British and the Americans would have the same size of navy, or be allowed to construct the same size of navy, with a very specific tonnage limit. So they had a 5:5:3 ratio with the Japanese. So Americans and British the same, Japanese 3/5 of that. And then the French and the Italians got 1.75 ratio of when compared to the British and the Americans, which made the French somewhat unhappy because, again, delusions of grandeur. But effectively, they didn't really have an option, and they at some point might have realized that they were the only ones who thought that they could actually build anything beyond that capability. The Italians, while also not really being able to build anything, at least were putting an equal footing at the French, which annoyed the French, and the Italians basically were just kind of sitting at the sidelines there, grinning and feeling good about themselves being at the table with the big boys. The other thing that was decided was that any kind of capital ship, so battleships, battle cruisers and the like, should not exceed 35,000 tons of standard displacement and should not have guns larger than 16-inch or 400 millimeters, more or less. In terms of carriers, given that there were a couple of experimental things around, the restriction was that they shouldn't be any more than 27,000 tons in displacement, except for a couple of conversions, because everybody had laid down battleships, because they were already starting to naval arms race. So the question was raised, excuse me, could we maybe convert that to a carrier instead of just scrapping it all again? Because we just started building the darn things. So it was said, yeah, okay, taking that into consideration, your limit for a carrier that is converted is 33,000 tons. And everything that's currently a carrier doesn't count, because we'll call them experimental and just let them be, because that'd be too complicated. At that point, they were somewhat exhausted and decided that, okay, the only thing that we really need to limit now is anything about cruisers. Now, when it comes to cruisers, people had very, very different kind of needs for those, like the British, for example, and to a degree the French, but again, they didn't really have the economy for it, needed cruisers, a lot of cruisers, because they had an empire with colonial possessions to deal with, and cruisers are sort of the sweet spot between battleships and destroyers when it comes to sailing around long distance, bringing enough firepower to bear, and making sure that the uppity colonists don't get any funny ideas by showing them very, very big guns and say, you behave yourself or else. So in the end, everybody decided that 10,000 tons would be enough to build cruisers with, and that shall be the limit, and the limit it shall be. And 8-inch guns or 200 millimeters, roundaboutish, would be the limit. At this time, nobody had yet actually called a distinction between light cruisers with 150s or heavy cruisers with 200 millimeter guns. They were just cruisers all in all. So you couldn't build anything larger than 10,000 tons and not bigger than 8-inch guns. And on the sidelines, the Americans politely asked the British to please stop being allied with the Japanese. And given that the British were sort of tired of everything anyway, and it had already been decided not to renew the alliance, they agreed. Which then, in practice, meant that the British weren't going to be able to build the N3 class of ships. However, they were able to keep two of the Nelsons, which by that time would then be, somewhat the most modern, biggest battleships that they had, and with the obvious exception of HMS Hood, which they managed to not have to scuttle. The Americans couldn't do the South Dakotas, the first ones, not the second ones, but they did get to keep 3 of the Colorados, and they did get to convert a couple of things, for example, the Lexington-class battlecruiser into carriers with the aforementioned shenanigans. The Japanese, who had started building the Yamagis and the Tosa class, were not allowed to have the Amagis, and the keys were also not a thing. They were allowed to convert Kaga into a carrier, and they were allowed to keep Mutsu around. And the French then didn't really build anything major because, again, aforementioned reasons, and just converted the Bian into a carrier. So that is the very, very brief summary of the whole Washington Naval Treaty from 1921. Obviously, everybody cheated to a degree on it, but it effectively led to 8 years-ish of nobody actually building anything and everybody focusing on dealing with Great Depression and economic factors, and people were not too unhappy about it. So where do we see the impact of that treaty in the game? Well, let's begin with the American tech tree. We obviously have the Colorado here at tier 7, which was adhering to the treaty limit, and I think the North Carolina was built later, but still within the limits of the 35,000 tons. I'm going to talk about the successive treaties in another video, in a part 2. Don't want to make it too long. When it comes to cruisers, obviously everything from Pensacola all the way up to the Wichita at tier 8 is adhering to the 10,000 ton limit, and that is also to a degree responsible for the relatively poor armor of some of these things. Because, armor is heavy and you can't just stick it on there. In the carrier side, we've got the Lexington at tier 8, which is one of the converted battle cruisers, which she was supposed to be a battle cruiser, but because of the treaty, she couldn't be one. And that's why she was converted into a carrier. And because she was a converted ship, there was a higher tonnage limit for that one as well. On the Japanese side, we have the Nagato at tier 7. And we also have the Mutsu in as a premium in the game. The key was not allowed to be existing. Neither was the Amagi in her form. We do, however, have the Kaga around, which is a converted battleship, again as a tier 7 premium carrier. Other than that, in terms of cruisers, the Japanese were mostly focusing on the Miyoko class of cruisers, trying to stick to the 10,000 tons limit. Like I said earlier, everyone was cheating somewhat, but the Miyokos were, as is traditional for Japanese cruisers, quite top-heavy and rather unstable in that regard, because they were sticking too many weapons on it, because again of the motivations and all of these kind of things. On the British side, the British obviously had gotten to keep HMS Hood, and they got to keep the Nelsons. So that's a premium again. And other than that, they had the county class of cruisers, which I think was the London. We do have the London here in. And we do have the Surrey, and I think Devonshire is probably a county as well. So a couple of these were constructed to tonnage limits. The Germans obviously, weren't allowed to build anything, and didn't matter because they just had sunk their own fleet and lost the whole thing. As I mentioned, the Soviets were busy inventing communism and nobody cared. The French, not much in the actual tech tree here. But the Bian, which is a conversion, we do have as a premium carrier, and the Italians were building the Trentos, and also at least somewhat adhering to the treaty limits. So in the next episode, no, the next part rather, I'll cover the next treaty and a little bit of what happened in between and what the impact of these things was. But I've tried to keep it short. It's not everybody wants to listen to half an hour of historical context. But I found it quite interesting that we can actually contextualize some of the ships in the game in a more broad manner when it comes to these naval treaties. Anyway, that's it from me today. Thanks everybody, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.